Welcome back to the History of the United States to 1877. We are finally in the last unit of our course, the fourth and final unit, which deals with slavery and the Civil War. This will take us from 1850 all the way to the end of our course in 1877. We have to discuss a couple of uncomfortable issues, and they're very important issues. So today we're going to discuss the history of slavery in the United States. Now, let me preface this by saying I am by no means an expert in this field. I did include several links in the PowerPoint so that you could go and explore some slave narratives that are found on the University of North Carolina, and they're a wonderful resource. There are hundreds and hundreds of accounts that you can go and read, and I'd recommend that you peruse them and learn as much as you can. I read several in preparation for this lecture, so I hope that will help provide some insight. So what we're going to do today, we're going to take a look at the necessity of slavery. Where did slavery come from in terms of why is it here? How did it become so popular? Why didn't it die out the way the founders kind of assumed it would in the late 1780s? And then all of a sudden it exploded in the 1800s and became this very important issue to Southerners. So we'll talk a little bit about the rise of cotton. We then need to talk about the peculiar institution itself. The history of slavery. To give you a little bit of a world context for it, I know a lot of students, when they study United States history, we focus so much on the history of slavery inside of our country that we don't understand the global context for that. So we'll provide a little bit of global context and then dig into the horrors of slavery that are on our own shores by looking at some narratives and some stories of some very remarkable people, to tell you the truth. Then once we've discussed slavery, we need to switch gears a little bit. We need to talk about, okay, so what are these Southerners saying about slavery, right? How are they defending this indefensible position of slavery and states' rights and these types of things? They're conflating these things together. So how are they going about defending this institution that today we know is indefensible? So that's going to be an interesting and sort of disturbing look behind the curtain, so to speak, of what these Southerners are thinking. And then finally, because we're setting up the Civil War, I wanted to take time and talk about the discrepancies, the disparities between the North and the South in terms of manufacturing, in terms of their industrial capacity. So we're going to look at some charts and graphs from the census of 1860 to really get a good sense of why the South inevitably will lose this coming war between the states. And so that's about where we'll kind of wrap up this first lecture. So the first thing I want to talk about here in regards to slavery is why that particular labor system became so important to the Southern economy and to Southern agriculture. We discussed slavery to some degree back in the 1600s in Unit 1 when we were talking about the colonies and the establishment of slavery. And at first, slavery was not the most popular labor system in the South, in Virginia and these other southern colonies. Indentured servitude was, but because these indentured servants, after a term of a set number of years, would gain their freedom, and as a result of that freedom would gain English citizenship and have English rights and be able to vote, that became a problem, as we found out with Bacon's Rebellion. So it was a lot easier for these plantation owners to have a labor force that would never gain citizenship over time, right? They wouldn't become voters and be able to move the government with their numbers. And so we see the Virginia slave codes and the creation of a second class of people during this time with these slave codes. Now, we also mentioned slavery when we discussed the creation of the U.S. Constitution and how this was a third rail here. This was a potentially deadly situation to try to resolve at the time, because both sides were so entrenched in their positions that there really was no compromise. There's no way to compromise. Plus, most of the founders believed that slavery would die off on its own accord because it was becoming less and less economical. That would, of course, change, which is what we're going to talk about now, which is what caused that change. And the thing that's going to cause that change is cotton itself. Cotton is going to become this very popular product, this cash crop product, all of a sudden in the late 1790s, it becomes a lot more popular than it was before. So let's talk a little bit about cotton and why this popularity suddenly occurred, and then I'll show you some some graphs and charts, and we can talk about that. So cotton plants are a tropical or subtropical shrub that produce these little bowls of white, fluffy fiber. And spinners and weavers can collect these fibers, and they can twist them into thread and then weave these threads into cloth. Now, do not forget, in the middle of this, we're in what's called the Industrial Revolution. Remember, we talked about some of the early milling and industrial things that are being introduced to the United States in the 1790s. But Great Britain is the powerhouse of Industrial Revolution, and they need lots of cotton. They have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands maybe, I haven't checked the numbers in a while, but they have thousands and thousands of these mills and these factories that are churning out very affordable cloth that is making them lots of money. And so the South is going to start producing all of the cotton that's going to feed this inexhaustible thirst for fiber and this Industrial Revolution. So this crop, however, it's a pretty finicky crop. It requires long periods of warm weather and a moderate amount of rainfall. And this made the southern colonies in North America the perfect place to begin the cultivation of this crop. And we will see, cotton production beginning as early as the 1620s, right? But it's not produced to a great degree. In fact, in the 1790s, the United States only produced about 1.5 million pounds of cotton. That amounts to about 3,000 bales, and most of that is produced in South Carolina. So let me show you a little map here. So if you take a look here, this is a graphic showing the spread of cotton production, and you can see in early 1800, South Carolina is most of where this production is taking place, and you can see here it's very little production. Now, why is it that there's so little cotton being produced here? Well, it's a very simple explanation. The reason cotton is not being produced is because it's too labor intensive. It requires too much work. You have these bowls, these little puffs of white fluff, but inside them you have seeds and stems and leaves, and it takes a tremendous amount of labor to clean these things out. And it would not be until Eli Whitney's cotton engine or cotton gin where this process would be improved exponentially, right? So let me, the Industrial Revolution is going to see the introduction of this cotton gin. It will enable one person to remove the seeds from 300 pounds of cotton in a single day. 300 pounds of cotton can be cleaned by a single person using a cotton gin. Now, without a cotton gin, it would take a person an entire day to clean 1 pound of cotton by hand. So, you've got one person cleaning the seeds and the stems and the leaves and trying to, get the trash out of this cotton. At the end of a full day's work, they have 1 pound to show for it. That's not much. All of a sudden, with this cotton engine, you can throw hundreds and hundreds of pounds in here. One person by themselves can turn this little engine, and they could clean out all these stems, and they could clean 300 pounds of cotton in a day. This is a dramatic increase, and all of a sudden you're going to see the popularity of cotton, which there's a high demand for. Therefore, because it's labor intensive, the price is going to be high because Great Britain wants as much cotton as possible so they can make clothes, but it's very labor intensive, and so the costs are high. Well, the cotton engine is going to drop those costs, and so a lot of people are going to jump on board with this. So let's go back to our little map here and take a look at how this is changing. By the time we get to 1840, you can see cotton production is expanding, not just from South Carolina, but into Georgia and Alabama, and Mississippi, Louisiana, into Tennessee, parts of Virginia, North Carolina. You're going to see cotton really start to expand. And with this expansion, unfortunately, comes slavery. And so we need to talk about this expansion. Now, by the early 1800s, cotton production increased to about 40 million pounds per year. That's 100,000 bales a year. And this composed 22% of all U.S. exports. Again, most of this production came from South Carolina, and by 1820, cotton production expanded to include parts of Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, the places that I mentioned just previously. U.S. production increased to 160 million pounds per year. That's 320 bales per year by the time you get to 1820. A majority of the world's cotton came from the southern United States by 1830, and by 1840 the South produced more than 830 million pounds of cotton. That is more than 1.6 million bales of cotton, and that makes up about 51% of all U.S. exports. So the southern states are incredibly dependent upon these exports, and this helps to explain why Henry Clay's American system of tariffs was so unpopular in the South. More than 2 billion pounds of cotton came from these southern plantations, and this is going to be more than $190 million, or 60% of exports, as we move closer to the 1860s. It was U.S. cotton that helped supply the needs for the European Industrial Revolution, and Great Britain purchased 80% of the cotton it needed for its factories from the United States. Less than 20% of U.S. grown cotton went to U.S. owned factories. The wealth and economic power stemming from the exportation of cotton emboldened many Democrats to overestimate the influence of cotton. So basically what you're having here is as cotton becomes this popular thing, it becomes the main export of the United States. Now you still have these tariffs under Henry Clay's trying to tariff and create manufacturing in the North. That now you get a sense of why southern states, particularly South Carolina, who's so dependent on this crop, are so angry about that tariff of abominations. In 1828, they're so angry about these tariffs because they don't produce anything other than raw materials. They have to import all of their goods, and all of those prices go up, and the price that they're sending out is ruined, and so this is really going to hurt them. Now, these Southerners are going to look at the dependence that these foreign countries seem to have on American exports, and they're going to think that they can flex some economic muscles. I'll give you a couple of examples. One famous example that I've already mentioned was that of Thomas Jefferson. In 1807, he decided to embargo England. Right? England needs our cotton. 80% of their cotton comes from us. So let's embargo them, and that'll hit them in the pocketbook, and then they'll come around and do what we want. And it didn't work the way they anticipated, because here's the trick. They got 80% of their cotton from the United States because it was easy, but that doesn't mean it's the only place in the world that produces cotton, as we'll find out. Another infamous example of this comes from a speech delivered in 1858 by a senator from South Carolina named James Henry Hammond. On March 4th, 1858, Hammond delivered a speech defending the economic independence of the South. He argued that northern manufacturing interests, with their tariffs and regulations, breed wars, while the agricultural South would simply invite peace and trade by opening up the country to free trade. Hammond continued by predicting this, quote, "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we can bring the whole world to our feet. The South is perfectly competent to go on for 1, 2, or 3 years to come. It would be an immense advantage to her. I am not so sure but that after 3 total years' abstinence she would come out stronger than she ever was before, and better prepared to endure afresh upon her great career of enterprise. What would happen if no cotton were furnished for 3 years? I will not stop to depict upon what everyone can imagine, but this is certain. England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her to save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." So this famous quote from Hammond in the Senate is basically alluding to the fact that he is very confident that if the South were to stop producing cotton because of, at this time in 1858, there's fear of, the South separating, and there's some anger about the spread of slavery, that if the South were to shut down its production, England would jump over itself to ensure the continued importation of cotton. And why would this senator think that Britain would jump in to a local war, a local political disagreement just because of cotton? Well, I'll give you an example. That's exactly what England did in China. We have what's called the Opium Wars. Here, England did in fact topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world into a war with China to protect its opium trade. Now, I could go into more detail on this if you'd like, but I doubt you care. But essentially what happens is the Chinese were trying to cut down on this illegal drug trade that the British were pushing from the East India Company into China. And when the Chinese started confiscating and destroying British opium, British products, the British Navy went to war and forced the Chinese to open up their borders and basically became a protectorate of the British. And so what Hammond is saying is, surely our product, cotton, is far more important to the British economy than some little opium crop in India, right? So obviously, if cotton were to be damaged to that degree, Britain would jump in and start a war with the United States to preserve the cotton that it would produce. And of course, this is a grave miscalculation. I mean, Hammond is a fool if he believes that the southern states could hold out for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years. I mean, obviously the Civil War goes on for 4 years, and the South is able to survive, but they're by no means winning the war after 1863, right? So they win the war for a little bit, but they're not going to be able to hold out because they don't have the manufacturing, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. So now that we have a brief understanding of why cotton became such a major product and why the South became so dependent upon slavery, let's take a little time to talk about slavery itself, or as one person aptly described it, a fearful alchemy. In a speech in 1857, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper aptly explained the justification for slavery. She explained, 20,000 lives are annually sacrificed on the plantations of the South. Such a sight should send a thrill of horror to the nerves of civilization and impel the heart of humanity to lofty deeds. And so it might, if men had not found out a fearful alchemy by which this blood can be transformed into gold, and instead of listening to the cry of agony, they listen to the ring of dollars and stoop down and pick up the coins. This is pretty much exactly right. They found a way to transform the humanity of these unfortunate people into gold in their pocketbooks, and they're not willing to let that go. Not for principles, not for God Almighty, right? They will redefine everything. They will redefine morality. They'll redefine rights. These Southerners will do anything they can to justify slavery, as we'll find out when we talk about the justifications of slavery, or at least their arguments for the justification of slavery. And so what we'll do now is we're going to take a look at slavery in the United States. But before we do that, we need to put a little bit of context to it and discuss slavery through history. Unfortunately, the history of slavery goes back to ancient times, to antiquity. The ancient Egyptians used Jewish slaves. In 1600 BC, you have Hammurabi's Code, and it has laws dealing with fugitive slaves. Slavery existed in Shang, China, 4,000 years ago. It fueled the Roman Empire for hundreds of years, and even African tribes used slaves as well. Islamic countries would not end their dependence on slave labor until the mid-1900s. No nation, no culture, and no society is free from the evils of slavery. And the United States, unfortunately, is no exception to this rule. From the nation's founding in 1776 to 1863, slavery existed in the United States. This institution left a horrible mark of abuse and still impacts American society to this very day. So let's talk about where this slave trade comes from and how it was introduced to North America. So Portuguese traders first began trying to find some way to make money, right? The Portuguese are bouncing around the coast of Africa trying to contact with the Indian Ocean trade. They do make contact with the Indian Ocean trade, but they have nothing of value to trade with the Indians, so that becomes frustrating. However, on the western coast of Africa, Portuguese traders began to work with African chieftains to get African slaves. And as a result of this, soon the slave trade will expand as the Spanish move across the Atlantic and into the Americas. According to Philip Curtin's The African Slave Trade, approximately 10 million souls crossed the Atlantic as slaves. Most of these unfortunates made their way to Portuguese colonies, about 39% of them, or 38.5%. The West Indies became the home to about 18% of these slaves, and the Spanish Empire, about 17.5%. A total of 9.7% of slaves shipped across North America came to British North America. The first African slaves entered the British colonies as a result of a Dutch trader in 1619 at Jamestown. Nevertheless, as we've already discussed, slavery was not the preferred labor system, not until after Bacon's Rebellion in approximately 1676. So after this, plantation owners decided that these laborers without English rights were easier to control, and that's when it became more popular. So as you can see from this map, most of these slaves are coming into the West Indies, coming into Cuba, coming into the Caribbean, and then another large swath of them are coming south into Brazil. Very few actually made it into the northern colonies, but any is too many, right? So the English colonies are going to see their share of slaves, and of course this population is unhappily going to grow dramatically as dependence upon slavery becomes the norm, particularly in the southern colonies, as we've already discussed. Now this abominable trade would eventually end thanks to evangelical Christians like William Wilberforce, who was a member of British Parliament and a philanthropist, and he would push for Parliament to pass the Slave Trade Act of 1807. President Jefferson would also push an end to the slave trade in 1808. Now you may recall this was a part of the negotiations in the Constitutional Convention. Southerners were insisting that their slaves be used in representation. Northerners were upset about this, and to sort of balance the two interests, the 3/5 compromise was made, whereby a smaller percentage of the slaves would be used as representation, and as a counter to that, they would promise to end the slave trade within a certain number of years. And so by 1808, the United States would also end the slave trade. Now, these laws are a step in the right direction. They would not end slavery. And in fact, many slave owners in the South supported the end of the transatlantic slave trade because it created a monopoly for themselves. Now, if you wanted a slave, you had to buy it from a slaver in the United States, right, in these southern states. So you didn't have to compete with these people kidnapping, Africans and bringing them across the Atlantic. You just would sort of breed your own slaves. And this would lead to a dramatic increase in the cost of slaves. For example, a typical slave in 1800 cost around $300. 50 years later, in 1850, the cost of a slave would be north of $1,500. So you're going to see that this is going to, the slave trade ending is not going to be bad for slavers. But we'll discuss there are going to be other issues that we have to deal with. So there are, unfortunately, by 1860, there are 4 million slaves in the United States. So let's take a look at what the life of these people would be. Now, there are a number of slave narratives that you can read, hosted by the University of North Carolina. I left links to these that I found interesting. There was one slave narrative by a man named Charles Ball that I found interesting, and I will pull information from here for the purposes of this. And it's from this man, Charles Ball, that we get a description of the evils of slavery. And I thought his description was well put. Now, keep in mind that a lot of these slave narratives are transcribed and written by abolitionists in the North, right? So when a slave would win their freedom, win their liberty, they would travel the dangerous roads to get into the northern states, and then abolitionist churches and activists would take these people in and try to care for them and try to help them and tell their stories, and they would go on speaking tours throughout the North, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But Mr. Ball here described the evils of slavery as follows in his autobiography. He says, "It seems to be a law of nature that slavery is equally destructive to the master and the slave. For whilst it stupefies the latter with fear and reduces him below the condition of man, it brutalizes the former by the practice of continual tyranny, and makes him the prey of all the vices which render human nature loathsome." So what the argument here is that slavery, you have to take it out of the economic realm. Slavery makes you money. So what? That doesn't make it moral, right? So what abolitionists are doing is they're taking the issue of slavery and they're not arguing that it works or it doesn't work or that it makes you money or it costs money, because it obviously is not an efficient money-making thing, not in the long term, as we'll find out. In the short term, it would enable men to buy more land than they could farm themselves, and then they could simply hire these slaves to work the land for them, and they can sort of make more money than they otherwise would. So you have to take it out of the economic realm. And what this quote is doing is it's saying slavery is just as evil to the victim as it is the person perpetrating it, because it ruins your soul, right? It corrupts your nature so that you become a tyrannical tyrant, this sort of evil person. And so that's kind of where we're going here, talking about the life of a slave, right? So the life of a slave depended on a lot of different factors, okay? You can read a lot of different narratives and you're going to get different accounts. You're going to see people that are horribly brutalized. You're going to see people who have it, in comparison, relatively well. So the condition of slavery is not what makes slavery evil. You could be a pampered, a house pet of a person and not be free, and that's still a condition beneath human dignity, okay? So we need to make sure you understand that when we talk about these different levels of treatment, I'm not trying in any way to justify slavery and saying, oh, well, these slave owners were nice and these slave owners were mean, and if only they were all nice, it would have been better. I'm not saying that. That's obviously immoral and wrong, because it's not the condition that makes slavery evil. It's not your treatment that makes it evil. It's the fact that you're not given your full humanity, and so that's what we're going to talk about here. So a lot of different factors went into how slaves were treated, and one of those conditions was the temperament of the owner, the location of the slave, and just fate, just happenstance, just luck. In the best of circumstances, slaves, perhaps in Maryland or some other border state, might live in a modest cabin. Slave men would be permitted to visit their wives and children on the weekends. And then in these 2 days of week, many slaves were allowed to live a glimpse or a taste of a somewhat normal life. They were allowed to visit with their family. They were allowed to farm their own little modest garden or to go fishing to supplement their income. And so this would give them a little glimpse of normalcy. And no doubt these little moments just served as a terrible reminder for how poor their life was, right? I mean, if you only have 2 days of your week where you're able to enjoy your family and enjoy your free, a little taste of independence, it would make the rest of the week miserable in comparison. And even these respites with family saw children mostly naked, unclothed. Slave owners might provide their slaves one pair of shoes or 2 shirts or a pair of pants per year. And in the deeper South, it was even worse, right? Slaves barely were given a modest cloth to cover their dignity. It was also possible for slaves in some areas to augment their labor, right? So you had to work a full week for your owner, for your master. But then once you've worked those number of hours, let's say 40 hours a week or whatever was the minimum requirement, you could work overtime and that money was yours. So it was possible for slaves to work on their own time for extra money, but that requires 80 80 hours of work a week. I mean, like no time off and no time for yourself. But there are going to be some slaves who will do this to raise their own money, to purchase their own freedom, or to purchase the freedom of their loved ones, to try to liberate as many of their family members as they can. So you will see this happening occasionally, and we'll discuss a few of those cases. On the weekends, where they can visit with their family, men might enjoy a meal of fried fish with their family, from fishing. However, when the week began, when the weekend's over, all these different people would have to go back to their respective plantations. So your wife might be owned by someone over here, and you might be owned by someone over there. And on the weekends you can get together, but otherwise you're separated. You're forced to live apart most of the time. Now, during the week, overseers carried whips to ensure focus, right? To make sure that people were working constantly. And at night, slaves usually received a very meager meal of cornbread or corn mash, some type of rice. And one of the ways in which border slaves, slaves in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, Kentucky, a way in which these slaves were kept in check was the threat of being sold down south, right? Quote, down south. According to Mr. Charles Ball, who was a former slave and escaped to freedom, I'll quote from his autobiography. He says, "In Maryland, it had always been the practice of masters and mistresses who wished to terrify their slaves to threaten to sell them to South Carolina, where it was represented that their condition would be 100-fold worse than it was in Maryland. I had regarded such a sale of myself as the greatest of evils that could befall me, and had striven to demean myself in such manner to my owners as to preclude them from any excuse for transporting me to so horrid a place." So here you can see from Mr. Ball that, again, that was one of the arguments that slave owners would use to justify keeping their slaves. Like, oh, I treat them well, right? Without me, they wouldn't have a home. They wouldn't have the clothes that they have. They wouldn't have enough food or anything. I'm taking care of them, right? So it was almost like this, making them into children. But you would never treat a child this horribly. It was sort of this weird contradiction. And so a lot of slave owners were saying, well, I treat my slaves wonderfully because I give them one meal a day and it doesn't have, bugs in it. And boy, you should see how they treat slaves down south. It's much worse, right? So that type of justification is something that some slave owners would use to keep their slaves in check, or even to cure their own guilt, their own conscience for what they were doing. Being sold down south usually meant worse treatment, as Mr. Ball just mentioned in the quote I read. And why is that? Well, the reason for that is that border states were hoping to represent a sort of idyllic, moderate slave master to their northern visitors, right? So people from Pennsylvania and Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, they would cross and for trade or reasons, and they would go into the South, and they would see the genteel, the soft, the wonderful slave owner providing all these safeguards for their slaves. And they were hoping to sort of show a softer side to slavery, right? That was what they were trying to do. As opposed to the people who lived deeper in the South, they didn't have to worry about northern visitors. They didn't have to worry about their conscience being pinged by these people who don't like slavery. So that's one of the reasons why northern states owners, slave owners, tended to treat their slaves a little better. The tobacco plantations in the upper South would eventually give way to the cotton plantations once you cross the Yadkin River in North Carolina, and so that's when you started to get further away from the disapproving gaze of Northerners, and slave owners began to sort of drop any pretense of taking care of people. Unfortunately for Mr. Ball, he would be sold down south, and he recalled near starvation rations as opposed to what he lived with in the north. He recalled in one plantation in Georgia, he was so desperate for food that he could not resist the temptation to kill one of the owner's livestock. He killed a sheep, and he killed it with a hoe. He hid it out in the woods, cleaned it, and then he carried it back to his humble little home where he was, his shelter, and he put it in a large pot and he was boiling it. And he was tending the fire and tending this meal that he was looking forward to, and the owner showed up. He saw the fire. He was walking, he was walking around checking on things, and he saw this fire burning at 1 a.m. And so this man quickly, Charles Ball, quickly took his dirty clothes off and he threw it in the pot. And he told the owner he was washing his clothes, right? Oh, I was just washing my clothes, And his master became very angry, and he removed the shirt and he threw it in the dirt, threw it on the ground, and he warned him that being lazy and staying up late would not be allowed to interfere with his work, right? So you're still going to have to get up early. You got to get up early and do work. You can't stay up late. And so at this point, when he's chastising him for staying up, washing his clothes, the food in the pot sort of bubbled to the surface, and the master saw the meat and proceeded to beat Mr. Ball with his cane repeatedly, then bound his hands with a clothesline and arrested him for theft. Now they wanted to punish Charles Ball for stealing this sheep, even though he was starving. They wanted to punish him, but they didn't want to make it to where he couldn't work. So they decided to give him 12 lashes with a cracker, which is a little whip made of silk. And so they would give him 12 lashes with this silk whip, and then he was ordered. Other people were ordered to wash his wounds with hot water that was used to boil peppers. Right. So this is it's excruciating. After being left hanging for hours by his hands, he was eventually cut down and brought to the main house, where he would be given some medical attention, and there his mistress, said, "Oh, you should be grateful your punishment wasn't worse." Right? I mean, this is the justification that these slave owners are using. They're saying, "Oh, well, it could be worse for you, it's inconceivable to me, and I'm sure to you, to even understand the point of view of these slave owners, how they could treat people this way. But this is the only way I can sort of understand where they're coming from, is that they're trying to say, well, you could be worse, and you were stealing, and we got to keep you from stealing. It's almost like they view their slaves as children who can't be trusted. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they're lazy, they're good for nothing, we have to beat them. And to be honest with you, if I were a slave, I could imagine being rather lazy myself. And why would I want to work so hard for someone why would I want to work that hard for people, right? I mean, a good example of this, if you want to, take it out of the emotional situation that American slavery brings to mind, you can look at the treatment of prisoners of war in the Second World War, where the Japanese would do basically the same thing with their prisoners, right? They were neglectful, they had starvation rations, they were treated horribly, many of them died from disease and mistreatment, and the Japanese would basically do the same thing. They said, well, you're lazy, you're not working. Well, Americans didn't want to work for the Japanese in the middle of the war, so they were lazy. They were not as responsive, and so I think obviously you'd have that kind of resistance to labor if you were unfortunately a slave in the South. You'd see the same type of resistance. So you get these stereotypes of, well, slaves are lazy and liars and all these things, and that's not the result of the character of these people necessarily. It's the depravity of their situation. Obviously, it's not their character. It's the depravity of how they're being treated. Now, it seems that the worst part of slavery, aside from the obvious, was the insecurity of it all. At any moment, you could be stripped of your home, your family, you could be beaten, you could be murdered. Lynching and burning of slaves accused of crime occurred far too often in these cases. And it was the tyrannical nature of the master-slave relationship that completely warped and perverted the human spirit. It made people meaner than they needed to be. It took away the humanity of these unfortunates who were at their complete beck and call. It's a really unfortunate side effect of slavery. So many white men abused their slaves. They raped women. They mistreated their female slaves on a regular basis. Many black men suffered unspeakable pain and suffering from brutal masters, and this treatment no doubt inspired many people to run away. But that was easier said than done, because most slaves couldn't read. You get to a sign, you don't know if you're going further south or you're going north. Slaves didn't know how to go. They didn't have the resources to go. And so these fugitive slaves also didn't know who to trust, right? You go up to a farmhouse, and is this going to be someone that will sell you back and get you beaten or killed, or is this someone who will help you? Over time, a series of safe houses and allies will develop in the 19th century, and by 1850, many historians suggest that as many as 100,000 slaves would be escorted to freedom via what's called the Underground Railroad, and we'll talk about that as more and more people began to win their freedom, to fight for their freedom and to escape from the horrors of slavery and make their way into northern areas of the country. Abolitionist organizations and newspapers began to send these individuals on speaking tours where they could tell their stories. And two of the most famous of these people, there's many people who did this, but two of the more famous ones are Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, are two examples of people who gave these speeches to reveal the truth about slavery, the horrors and the misery of it, and to sort of peel away the veneer of genteel, slave masters. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look here at both of these individuals and what they had to say. So the first of these two remarkable people that we'll take a look at is Sojourner Truth. She was born in New York State in 1797 into slavery. She endured 4 different masters between 1806 and 1810, and her last owner showed her a lot of kindness, no doubt due to her virginal age. The master's wife, the mistress, picked up on this attention and made this young girl's life much harder than it needed to be. She eventually would marry another slave, a man named Thoms, and she would give birth to 5 children. Now, New York State, like many other northern states in the 1790s, began to establish a path to freedom for the people living as slaves. These men and women would become free upon obtaining the age of 21. But her owner did not release her. As a result, he took her youngest child. She would take her youngest child and she would escape. Upon learning that her 5-year-old son was sold to a planter in Alabama, Sojourner Truth sued for the return of her child, and she would win this lawsuit. Upon winning the return of her child, she became a devout Christian and worked for a minister in New York State. And through these connections, she began to join speaking tours and the abolitionist movement. In 1851, she delivered a very famous address called "Ain't I a Woman?" And in this speech, she challenged people to face the hypocrisy of their treatment of black women. So I'm going to read to you a portion of her speech here. "Where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, at all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman?" Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's it called? A member of the audience whispers, "Intellect." "Oh, that's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in back there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman? Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking you to do it. The men had better let 'em. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. This was a speech that Sojourner Truth delivered in Akron, Ohio in 1851. And you can see what she's trying to say here is she's saying that manners suggest that women have to be treated, as dainty individuals. They have to be helped into carriages. They have to be helped over mud puddles. They have to be assisted, and it's society protects women. And she's like, what about me? I don't get any protection. I don't get any special treatment, and I'm a woman. It's a powerful speech about the hypocrisy of how we're letting race and sex get in the way of what is right at this time. And it's a very powerful speech about that. Now, probably the most inspired and talented of all these escaped slaves to preach freedom during these various tours was a man named Frederick Douglass. After publishing his autobiography in 1845, Douglass became quite popular. He traveled to London, and throughout the United States he worked closely with William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a famed abolitionist who, if you listen to the podcast for the previous lecture, you would have picked up on who he was. He was an abolitionist who believed that the United States was born in sin and was irredeemably evil. The Constitution was evil and flawed because slavery was allowed to exist, and so it had to be destroyed and everything rebuilt from the ground up. He was quite a radical. And Douglass admired William Lloyd Garrison and followed him to a degree, but then learned to disagree with William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass began to, instead of saying that the Constitution should be destroyed and that the Declaration was a lie, Douglass took a different tact. He was a smart man. Frederick Douglass would begin to say, you say you believe these things, prove it. You say you believe all men are created equal. Okay, prove it. You say you believe in, the Declaration of Independence. You say you believe in your Constitution, which has, limited government and rights for the individual. Prove it. And so this is going to sort of ping the conscience of a lot of people in the United States. This is not that different, really, than the same tact taken by Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s. It was a similar sort of idea. This idea that we have a promissory note from his famous speech in Washington, D.C. There's a promissory note where this government is promising certain rights and privileges of citizenship, and it's not being done. So this is going to be Frederick Douglass's case. And one of the more powerful excerpts from this is a speech that he gave on July 4th, 1852. So we're going to take a look at this speech in a moment. So before we take a look at Frederick Douglass' very powerful July 4th speech, let's take a look at who he is, where he comes from, and who this remarkable man is. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland. He grew up with his grandparents, and at the age of 6 he worked at the White House plantation in eastern Maryland. After the death of his overseer in 1826, Douglass became the property of a Baltimore family. And contrary to law and common practice, this family started to educate young Douglass. The woman in this family took a liking to the boy. He was smart. He was a good kid, and so the mistress of the family took him in, taught him the basics of reading and writing, and gave him special attention. However, this would end after the owner decided that thoughts might inspire freedom, that these ideas that you're giving him might actually inspire him to know that his condition is not good. And really, Christianity played a role in this as well. As many slaves began to convert to Christianity, they began to see that that there was something better, they shouldn't be content with where they are. So Douglass learned quite early that education and slavery were incompatible concepts, and he continued to teach himself literacy. He strove to learn everything he could. He began to teach other slaves on the plantation as well. At the age of 16, Douglass's owner sent him to a man named Edward Covey. He was a man known as a slave breaker, and under Covey's harsh treatment, Douglass wrote that the frequent beatings broke him, body and soul. Eventually, Douglass angrily confronted Covey, and this event discouraged further beatings. But Douglass saw that this was his transition to manhood, where he stood up for himself. Where this man was beating him constantly until Douglass, basically pushed him up against a wall and said, "That's it. That's enough." And that was the point at which he considered himself standing up as a man, as a human, and not as a slave. In 1838, Douglass escaped slavery and traveled to Philadelphia, and soon after gaining his freedom, he desired a new name to mask his true identity from his former owners. A friend who recently read The Lady of the Lake by Walter Scott suggested Douglass. After settling in Massachusetts, Frederick Douglass became active in the abolitionist movement, and he also attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And of course, the Seneca Falls Convention was a women's rights movement. You'll find a lot of overlap between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. At least you would until the 14th Amendment is passed. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Eventually, he would break from William Lloyd Garrison's view. As I mentioned earlier, Douglass supported the founding documents, and he saw the end of slavery as a political, as a thing that could be done politically. This tactic would see the formation of the Liberty Party in 1840 and the Free Soil Party in 1848 and again in 1854. Eventually, these minor political parties would coalesce into a modern Republican Party, which was an anti-slavery party, or at least it was against the spread of slavery in 1854. Douglass's support for political activism even moved him to argue against John Brown's attempts to raid a U.S. armory and encourage a slave revolt in the South. Douglass expressed his support for the founding in a powerful speech that he delivered in 1852 in his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" Douglass praised the bravery and idealism of the founders, but he also contrasted their diligent devotion to freedom with the current brand of political politician. This is this new brand of politician who's carefully and fearfully compromising to constantly avoid trouble. So I'm going to read to you some excerpts of this speech. I have the entire speech in the speaker's notes. So if you go to the slide in our presentation, you can read the full speech. I definitely recommend that you read it. But I'll read some highlights from it. Okay. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance, and to the signs and the wonders associated with that act and that day. The celebration also marks the beginning of another year of our republic, and it reminds you that America is 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years, though a good old age for a man, is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. 80 years and 10 is the allotted time for individual men, but nations number their years by thousands. And according to this fact, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day, of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive. and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worth much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during the great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England wrong is exceedingly easy. But there was a time when to pronounce against England and in favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men. And if they did not go mad, they became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we at this distance of time regard it. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to rise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests, and though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from the agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. Fully appreciating the hardships to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, honorably inviting the scrutiny of an onlooking world, reverently appealing to the heaven to attest their sincerity, soundly comprehending the solemn responsibility they were about to assume, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them, your fathers, the fathers of this republic, did most deliberately, under the inspiration of a glorious patriotism and with a sublime faith in the great principles of justice and freedom, lay deep the cornerstone of the national superstructure which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice and liberty, prosperity and independence, bequeathed by your fathers, is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct, and let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, lowering up to heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in uncoverable ruin. I can today take up the plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. By the rivers of Babylon, where they sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there that they carried us away captive required us a song, and they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee and shouts that reach them. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit. Where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. The manhood of a slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of a slave to read or to write. When can you point to any such law in reference to the beasts of the field? Then I may consent to argue the manhood of a slave. When the dogs of your streets, when the fowl of the air, when the cattle of your hills, and the fish of your sea, and the reptiles that crawl, shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation, as a matter beset with the great difficulty involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing of discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom, speaking of it relatively and positively and negatively and affirmatively? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What I am to argue is that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow man, to beat them with sticks, to lay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and to submission of their masters. Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need a storm, a whirlwind, and an earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. The charter of our liberties, which every citizen has a personal interest in understanding thoroughly. The testimony of Senator Breeze, Lewis Cass, and many others that might be named, who are everywhere esteemed as sound lawyers, so regard the Constitution. I take it, therefore, that it is not presumption in a private citizen to form an opinion of that instrument. Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. So this rousing speech, which I edited down and skipped a little bit to cut it down to size. I know it's a long listen, but I think it's very important that everybody in this country read or listen to this speech. And you can find beautiful oral examples of this. I think James Earl Jones has read it. There's several very powerful actors who've read this speech, and you can get on YouTube and you can listen to the thing in its entirety. But you can see exactly what Frederick Douglass is saying. He is saying that this country does not live up to its principles, and that's why when he says that the crimes of the United States are greater than other countries, it's not that other countries don't have slavery. It's not that other countries aren't beating and abusing unfortunate people. That's not what makes the crime in the United States greater. What makes the crime greater in the United States is the promise of liberty that we are offering to people, is the ideas that we don't like tyrants and yet behave tyrannical. It's the hypocrisy that makes it so intolerable. And I think Frederick Douglass, an absolute brilliant man. I mean, self-taught. I mean, it's like he's one of my heroes in American history. I'll be honest with you. We should put him on a $20 bill or something. I know there was some controversy about Andrew Jackson being on the $20 bill. If you were to replace him with somebody, I'd say Frederick Douglass. I mean, that's a man that everybody should study and know about. So I'll leave you with that. So our next, in 1791 and 1794, a slave revolt on the French-controlled island of Haiti occurred. It was inspired by the principles of the French Revolution, and the people of Haiti overthrew their government and established their independence. Now, this movement would also inspire slave revolts in the nearby United States. One such revolt, or allegedly, was led by a man named Denmark Vesey. Now, Vesey was a slave born in the Caribbean around 1767, and he moved to Charleston, South Carolina, around 1798 or so. Now, Vesey was a talented carpenter. He managed to earn enough money to purchase his own freedom. However, he did not quite have enough business to purchase the freedom of his family. He was working on that. In 1822, authorities arrested Vesey on the accusation that he was planning to murder slave owners and liberate more than 1,000 slaves and then sail to Haiti. Authorities arrested him and sentenced him to death by hanging. Now, I don't know if this is accurate or not. I don't know if he was guilty of this crime, but he was accused of it. And like I said, slave owners are very scared of any type of hint of a slave revolt. And so they dealt with him rather harshly. The most successful slave revolt in the United States occurred in 1831 in Virginia, and that is the Nat Turner Rebellion. So we'll need to talk a little bit about this. There's a lot more, obviously, you can get from it, but we're going to cover the highlights of it. Nat Turner was born in 1800, and he was a naturally intelligent man. He taught himself how to read. He demonstrated his devotion to Christianity by reading the Bible, praying and fasting daily. He was inspired by a religious experience in the 1830s to plot an attack and liberate himself from bondage. He used a solar eclipse to inspire supporters by claiming that the event symbolized a black man's hand covering the sun. And on August the 21st, 1831, a band of slaves began to attack white people in the area. They were hoping to conceal their actions, and so they used axes, knives, blunt tools in order to really hack people to pieces. Before the local militia even learned of the revolt, Turner and his followers had killed about 60 men, women, and children. And these slaves spared poor whites because in many cases they didn't live much better than the slaves themselves. So they were really only after the plantation owners and the people who were wealthier. Within 2 days, the Virginia militia ended the violence. Nat Turner hid for more than a month before he was finally captured. White slaveholders in Virginia violently lashed out at slaves in the area, and due to the fact that the black population outnumbered the white population, white Virginians seriously feared this uprising. This introspection led to the Virginia General Assembly debating the future of slavery itself within the state. And so instead of slowly introducing emancipation, which is something that was suggested, the Assembly passed a law that outlawed teaching black people how to read. They feared that reading their Bible and learning to read would liberate their minds and their imaginations and lead to revolts such as this. So yeah, some people in Virginia were like, you know what, slavery's not worth it. Let's do away with it. And instead they doubled down, unfortunately. Another slave revolt that's interesting to note in U.S. history is the Amistad case. So this revolt occurred on the high seas and would greatly impact U.S. law. Setting sail from Cuba on June the 28th, 1839, the Spanish schooner La Amistad found itself short of food due to poor weather slowing the progress of the ship, and loaded with more than 50 African captives recently kidnapped and illegally transported across the Atlantic. The ship's crew expected to sell the captives to these brutal sugar plantations in Havana. By July the 1st, the captives in the bows of the ship had filed their way free from the chains, and they managed to kill the ship's captain and many of the crew and gain control of the ship. They spared the life of the ship's navigator, hoping that he would return them to Africa, but instead he set sail for the United States. And this led to an interesting legal case, the United States v. Schooner Amistad in 1841. The United States Supreme Court took a case involving the officer of the USS Washington, who claimed ownership of the Amistad and its cargo. The resulting ruling proved a boon for American abolitionists. The court ruled that the transportation of Africans across the Atlantic violated international law. Therefore, the African mutineers were within their rights to win back their freedom. And this case freed the captives, and with the assistance of the American Christian missionaries, raised money to return these men to Sierra Leone, which was a British a British colony reserved for freedmen, right, for people that had been liberated and were returned to Africa. So the Amistad case was an important example of how the Supreme Court rested on the side of these men who had every right to liberate themselves from being illegally transported across the Atlantic. Other people who were trying to transport themselves across, out of slavery resulted in what's known as the Underground Railroad, and there were quite a few important people involved in this network. In the mid-1800s, there were these secret paths and safe houses that were developed for the purpose of aiding escaped slaves to find their way north into Canada or south into Mexico. Aided by abolitionists throughout the northern states, more than 30,000 people escaped the bonds of slavery. At its peak, this secret pathway led more than 1,000 people to freedom. Agents hid slaves in double-bottomed wagons or crates. The Quaker, by the name of Levi Coffin, and his wife helped more than 2,000 people. And the heroic and brave former slaves like Harriet Tubman, pictured here, risked recapture and potential death on treks back and forth into the South to liberate and help guide people out of slavery and into freedom. Desperate slaveholders filed thousands of fugitive slave lawsuits and angrily demanded that northern states assist in the return of their property. And the price of slaves on these border states began to drop greatly because of the fact that these slaves would be escorted to freedom. So the fugitive slave situation is going to increase throughout the 1840s and going into the 1850s, where these Southerners are going to be loudly demanding that laws be respected. If a sheriff discovers a runaway slave in Ohio, you should arrest that man and you should send him right back down to Kentucky or wherever he came from. It's affecting prices. Who's going to spend a lot of money on a slave when they can escape, and there goes your investment. So this is going to drive down the cost and the demand of slaves, especially along border states. And this is something that the Underground Railroad is very much going to contribute to. And so it's important that we mention it. All right. So now we have to give the devil his due. We have to take a look at what are these Southerners saying to defend slavery, if such a thing can even be done. How are they even attempting to do it? And unfortunately, they're going to have to twist themselves into intellectual pretzels to try to justify this thing. But we've got to look at their arguments nonetheless, and that's what we're going to do next. So the first Southern apologist that we're going to take a look at is a man named John C. Calhoun. And before we get too deep into this, I think it's important to note that no country attempted to justify slavery as much as the United States did, as Southerners did in the United States. there was tons and tons, millions of slaves in Brazil at the same time that the United States is dealing with this issue, and they don't have these speeches and these arguments to defend the existence of slavery down there. The reason they don't have these arguments is because no one questioned the legitimacy of slavery in Brazil, right? There wasn't this massive movement, this abolitionist movement, fueled by, American principles, the idea of individual rights. How can we say we believe in individual rights and liberty and at the same time hold slaves, right? So it's the contradiction within the United States that leads to people questioning slavery as legitimate, which then leads to these radicals apologizing for their institution and trying to justify it. So the first one we're going to look at is John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, you may recall, was vice president under Quincy Adams, and then later he was vice president under the next president, Andrew Jackson, and he would resign his post in 1832 over the tariff issue, if you'll recall, and the whole nullification crisis, which threatened potential war, but Jackson was able to put it down. He burned all of his bridges, with Jackson because of this, and he won a position in the Senate where he would remain until his death. He would be a vocal and sort of fire-breathing defender of slavery in the South, from South Carolina. In February of 1837, Calhoun stood on the floor of the United States Senate to declare compromise fatal to the Southern cause. He claimed that, quote, compromise would follow compromise until our ranks would be so broken that effectual resistance would be impossible, unquote. And he's not wrong. And from as far as a political stance, he's exactly right. Okay, as long as you keep compromising, you're going to get a smaller and smaller and smaller group who are defending slavery. He went on to say, we are now told that the most effectual mode of arresting the progress of abolition is to reason it down. And with this view, it is urged that the petitions ought to be referred to committee. That is the very ground which has taken at the last session of the other house. But instead of arresting its progress, it has since advanced more rapidly than ever. The subject of slavery is beyond the jurisdiction of Congress. They have no right to touch it in any shape or form or to make it the subject of deliberation or discussion. So what he is arguing is he's not defending slavery. He's not even bothering to defend slavery. He's simply trying to offer political strategy to preserve slavery. And he's saying that if we want to preserve our institution, we can't compromise with these abolitionists. It only encourages them. We can't have an argument with them. I wonder why. Probably because you can't win the argument. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, so they're actually going to put in a gag order on the House, sort of infamous gag order where you can't even debate. You can't mention slavery at all. And this was sort of one of those olive branch things that Henry Clay and the Whigs would do to try to keep the country together. Now, Calhoun, in his speech, characterized the nature of the abolitionist movement, and he issued a warning to those who consider the movement irresolute. Okay, so here's continuing his speech. Calhoun said, quote, they who imagine that the spirit now abroad in the North will die away of itself without a shock or convulsion have formed a very inadequate conception of its real character. It will continue to rise and spread unless prompt and efficient measures to stay its progress be adopted. Already it has taken possession of the pulpit, of the schools, and to a considerable extent of the press, those great instruments by which the mind of rising generation will be formed. All right, so what Calhoun is complaining about here is that they're losing the culture war, right? These slave owners are losing the narrative of slavery. They're losing it, right? We've got a country built on freedom. We've got a country built on the ideals of freedom. So the culture is already leaning to the side of freedom. And then on top of that, you've got the religious institutions, you've got the press, you've got schools, you've got all of these things impacted by this philosophy of liberty. We're teaching children the Declaration of Independence. We're teaching children about the American Revolution and the founding of our country. And so the culture is moving away from the idea of slavery, which is exactly what the founders were hoping for. I would argue that that's exactly what they were hoping for. They just didn't quite know how to do it. They didn't have the political clout at the time to do it. Now, we're 40 years after, we're 50 years into the country, and we've got a generation of people who were raised from the ground up believing in liberty, believing in freedom, and not wanting slavery for themselves. And it doesn't take too long for you to go, well, maybe people don't want slavery for themselves either, right? Even if they are black, right? So this is going to break down the racism. It's going to break down the arguments. And Calhoun is lamenting it. He's like, oh my goodness, we are losing this cultural fight. And he would go on to say that Jefferson is absolutely right. When Jefferson was predicting how the Missouri Compromise would lead to problems, he agrees. Calhoun predicted, like Jefferson, that a coming crisis is unavoidable. He said, quote, abolition and the Union cannot coexist. This is the argument coming from the South. He promises that the South will, quote, cannot surrender our institutions. And as far as he's concerned, why should they, right? Why should they do this? Because he argues that the two races inhabiting the section of the Union is indispensable to the peace and happiness of both, right? This is that immoral argument that we're taking care of those slaves. Think about how awful it would be if they didn't have us white people to take care of them. It's a horrible, it's an immoral argument to make, and that's the only thing they can say. You can't say that slavery is good. You can simply say that, oh, well, we're taking care of them. He actually goes so far, well, I actually wrong. He goes so far to say slavery is good. I misspoke just now. He holds that slavery is a positive good. I'll quote you for this. I misspoke because I thought who would be dumb enough to do this, but obviously John C. Calhoun is that person. He said, quote, I hold it, slavery, to be a good, and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition. Calhoun defended slavery on the basis that civilization had always employed the labor of others to survive. Southern apologists for slavery believed that black people in slavery enjoyed better life than the black people in Africa. In fact, Calhoun claimed that African slaves lived a superior life under the, quote, kind superintending care of his master and mistress, unquote, than paupers currently living in northern cities. In addition, he glorifies slavery for its ability to insulate the South from the age-old conflict between labor and capital. Well, this is obviously true. When one side of the equation is denied agency, conflict is easily avoided. Furthermore, Calhoun forgot a basic tenet of human existence. Man does not live by bread alone. Despite having more security and employment and food and shelter, slaves suffered the depravity and inhumanity that far exceeded the superficial benefits that he would mention. Clearly, if this were a case, and another argument, like obviously Calhoun is full of crap, because clearly, if these poor white people living in the North were that much worse than the slaves of the South, then why wouldn't all those white people run south to be slaves? Right? Why wouldn't they leave their evil jobs in the North and go down and work a cotton plantation in South Carolina? Of course they wouldn't, because it doesn't matter if you have a shore meal or a place to live. What matters is that everyone knows that slavery is not in alignment with humanity, that it is a mean and contrary condition to the human soul. So I find the arguments to be laughable, honestly. But I mean, we do have to give them, we do have to at least give them their fair shake here, so we can understand where they're coming from. So Calhoun's argument is basically that throughout all of history, we've always had people who are working and people who are not working. Okay, brilliant. And that, we have no labor disputes in the South. We don't have to, we don't have to worry about, taking care of our employees. No joke, because they're slaves. They don't have any freedom. So of course you don't have to worry about that. So another argument that we're going to look at comes from a man that we've already quoted, and his name is James Henry Hammond. I'm going to give you an excerpt of a speech that he gave. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I have the speech quoted in the notes if you want to, but basically he goes in for the whole, Southern slaves are better off than Northern workers. That he does that whole thing, and he also goes, with, society is built upon, poor people who are dumb and can't do anything but work for us because we're super smart and and white. It's an insane argument. It's not an argument at all. It's just ridiculous. But I will quote a little bit of it as we move through here. So he says, in all social systems there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which heads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mud-sill of society and a political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other except on this mud-sill. Fortunately for the South, we found a race adapted to this purpose, to her hand, a race inferior to our own, but eminently qualified in temper and vigor and docility and capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We used them for our purpose, and called them slaves. We found them slaves by the common consent of mankind, which, according to Cicero, Les Naturalistes, the highest proof of what is nature's law. We are old-fashioned in the South, yet it is a word discarded now by ears polite. I will not characterize the class at the North by that term. But you have it. It is there. It is everywhere. It is eternal. The senator from New York said yesterday that the whole world had abolished slavery. Aye, the name, but not the thing. All the powers on earth cannot abolish it. God only can do it when he reveals the fiat. Quote, the poor ye always have with you. Unquote. For the man who lives by daily labor and scarcely lives at that, and who has but to put out his labor in the market and take the best he can get for it, in short, your whole hireling class of manual laborers and operatives, as you call them, are essentially slaves. The difference between us is that our slaves are hired for life and well compensated. There is not starvation, no begging, no want for employment among our people, and not too much unemployment either. You are hired by the day, not cared for, and scantily compensated, which may be proved in the most painful manner in any hour, in any street, in any of your large towns. This was a speech delivered by James Henry Hammond in response to an argument about slavery being miserable, right? And of course, we know slavery is miserable. We've already discussed this, and I've already warned you that one of the justifications that these slave owners will use is that, oh, we treat them so well, we pay them, they have 3 hots in a cot, right? They have all this, and we know that that's not true. We've read some of the slave narratives, right? I've read to you some of the punishments and starvation rations deep into the southern plantations. This is not true. But this man from South Carolina is delivering this speech, in Congress. And I think it's important to note that he is basically conflating 2 different things. He's basically using an argument from Marxism, honestly, is what he's using to justify this, right? He's saying that that you're always going to have oppressed people and you're always going to have oppressors, and there's no way to do it. And progress demands that you have these 2 groups, oppressor and oppressed, and that's just the way life is. If you want progress, you're going to have to break some eggs to make an omelet, is basically what he's saying. And he's saying that the North, you do the same thing that we do, you just call it by a prettier name, and you have less concern for your workers' well-being than a slave owner has for his slave, right? This is horse crap, all right? I mean, the average annual wage for a factory worker in the United States in 1850 was $176, right? That's what the annual wage was in 1850. By 1860, it had gone up to $196. Once slavery is abolished and the country begins its industrial revolution, you're going to see wages for regular people increase by like 60%, 70%. We'll look at the numbers when we talk about this in our next course, but it goes up dramatically, the wages for regular people. It is not slavery that builds the wealth of this country. It is slavery that held it down. Because once slavery is gone, you don't have this cheap version of labor. You got to find labor-saving devices. That's why in the 1850s you're going to see, McCormick reapers, and you're going to find, tractors and different things are going to be developed. Well, not tractors, but these farm implements will be developed in the 1850s, and we'll talk about that, because they don't have slaves in the North. They have to be innovative. They have to think outside the box. They have to do these things to stay competitive. And the South is lazy. It doesn't have to do that. It doesn't have to innovate. It doesn't have to change. Its labor costs are zero, except for the cost of a fugitive slave, the cost of purchasing new slaves, those types of things. And they're going to be making laws to try to fix that problem, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So Hammond's justification here is that we have the same, you have the same thing in the North, you just call it something pretty, and you're upset because we call it something more realistic, right? That's his argument. Another Southerner that I wanted to read to you, to give you just how crazy and how twisted these people would become in order to justify the institution of slavery, comes from a man named Alexander Stephens, whom you may know as the Vice President of the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. This man basically rejects the Declaration of Independence. He absolutely rejects the Declaration of Independence because that's a problem. The Declaration of Independence is a problem. All right, all men are created equal. You can't. It says it. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. That among these rights are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that the purpose of government is to protect these rights. If that's true, slavery is by definition wrong and evil, and there's no way to defend it. So, if you have this Declaration of Independence that's making you question slavery, well, let's just do away with the Declaration. And that's why I wanted to read to you a portion of this speech. This is called the Cornerstone Speech. This was delivered in March of 1861 when Georgia was debating secession, and this was a speech that was given to convince people to secede from the Union in 1861. So he says, quote, Thomas Jefferson in his forecast had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen of the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of Providence, the institution would be effervescent and pass away. This idea, though not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea at the time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly used against the constitutional guarantees thus secured because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the idea of a government built upon it, when the storm came and the wind blew, it fell. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. Unquote. This is abominable, right? This whole idea of essentially we're taking it, right? You either have to reject the Declaration of Independence, or you have to reject slavery. And this man and people in the South refused to reject slavery. They embraced white supremacy as the basis for justifying slavery. They're not arguing that black people aren't people by 1861. That argument's done, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass's brilliant speech from a decade earlier proved that you can't argue that black people aren't people. The argument now is that they're just inferior. They're just not as good, right? And that's horse crap, right? That's complete junk, right? So to justify slavery and racism, Southerners were forced to reject the Declaration of Independence. Now, Abraham Lincoln, like previous abolitionists, would embrace the principles of the Declaration. He described the Declaration of Independence as, quote, an apple of gold, unquote, right? It represented the great ideals which guided the nation toward liberty and justice. The Constitution is a silver frame which helps us attain these lofty goals of equality before the law and natural rights. A few months So in January of 1861, Lincoln wrote a speech called Fragment on the Constitution and the Union. This was, of course, during the time when several states had already withdrawn from the Union. He wasn't quite yet inaugurated president, but he'd been elected, and he was trying to bring people together. And so he wrote, "All this is not the result of accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence enterprise and industry to all. The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we have declared our independence of Great Britain, but without it we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters. The assertion that of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the frame of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So let us act that neither picture nor apple shall ever be blurred or bruised or broken." So what Lincoln is doing, this is a direct and very nice argument against what Stevens is saying here. Now, of course, Stevens, his argument is in reaction to Lincoln, okay? But the argument is about the Declaration of Independence. What is the value of this document? Stevens argues it's wrong. It says that people are equal. We know that's not true. White people are superior, right? That's what Stevens is saying. Lincoln is saying, hold on. The Declaration is the goal, right? That is what we're heading toward. The Constitution itself is simply the roadmap to get there, and we're constantly moving in that direction. We may not get there completely, but that's our goal, and our goal is to try to move toward liberty for all. Essentially, the Civil War is a rebirth of our country, and Abraham Lincoln is going to write the goals for the next 100 years, right? I mean, that if you look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the civil rights movement in the 1860s and 1870s, you see that is the goal, but it's going to be sidetracked, right? It's political expediency and politics will get in the way, but this will be a new goal for the country. So even though we have these various arguments, we have these freed slaves voicing their opinions, making people look in the eye of slavery, look at look the evil in the eye, and then have to say it out loud and see the victims of this abusive system. Slave owners are having to twist themselves into knots in order to defend this indefensible position. It's a very difficult thing to understand why people supported slavery, because it's so obvious to us that they shouldn't. It's so obvious that slaves are people. It's so obvious that it's immoral and it's hypocrisy. And the only situation I can sort of compare it to, and this is controversial, but I'm trying to look for a historical comparison, would be the issue of abortion. Like slavery, it is a situation where a person determines whether or not another person has humanity or not, right? I'm the slave master. I will determine whether this person is a human or property. And the same thing with abortion, where it's the mother who determines whether the child is a child or not. It's the mother who determines whether it's a human that deserves life. And unlike slavery, you don't have victims of abortion escaping, right? I mean, they're children and they can't run as far, right? So as they are ripped limb from limb and crushed and murdered, according to someone who's against abortion, that would be their argument. this is not that different than slavery. It's not any different than the rights that are being denied to slaves. Now, people that are in favor of abortion, they would argue it's a positive good. It enables women to live their life without the burden of being a mother, and that's an argument that we're having now, right? So I don't mean to get into the politics of this. I'm just trying to make you understand that it's a very powerful and emotional issue, and both sides are entrenched. And and we're going to look back on the abortion issue. I think in 50, 60 years we're going to look back on it and have some similar conversations regarding how people defended slavery. So this is something that you can think about. If you disagree, that's perfectly fine. It's a free country. God bless you. But this is something I just wanted you to sort of think about because slavery is the original sin of our country. It's something that we are trying to live down, and it's important that you understand where these people are coming from. Both sides are coming from. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to discuss is the disparity between the North and the South. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this antebellum South in terms of their industrialization, in terms of what's the politics going on, right? So let's take a look here. Here's a chart of the United States. Let me get out of the way. Here's a chart of the United States, and it shows the progression of slave states to free states between 1789 and 1861. So you can see your slave states are in red, your free states are in blue, and then you have the other countries that are around it. So in the 18th century, you're going to see a slow progression of states. So you can see that at first, there's more slave states than free states. But by the time we get to 1821, it's equal, right? And that's why we have that crisis in 1821. That's what the crisis is about, because the South is running out of room. The South is based on agriculture. It's based on cotton and cash crops. They're running out of land. As you get into the plains, it's not going to be good for slaves. And so they're limited in where they can go to spread slavery. And so what I want you to notice is that as we move into 1837, we try to bring in states in pairs, right? We're trying to bring people in pairs so that we can balance the Senate because of the compromise that Henry Clay is working on. But once we get into the 1840s, we have additional things going on here, right? I mean, Texas is going to join the Union as a slave state, and this is something that we'll talk about when we get to the Compromise of 1850 in our next lesson. You can see that the Wilmot Proviso, which was proposed, would limit slavery in all of this Western territory. But let's be perfectly honest. Most of this territory is desert. You're not gonna have slaves out here anyway. You might be able to get some slaves in California, but for reasons that we'll talk about, California is definitely not going to be in favor of that. So as we move through here, going into 1848, 1846, you can see that there's more slave states, right? So we have additional slave states here, which throws the balance of power back in the favor of the Southerners. We move into 1858, and nope. You can see that it's clear that the future of this country, as it's broken up into smaller states and more senators are introduced, that the South has nowhere to grow. It doesn't have the ability to defend itself in the long haul because of the way that the country is laying out in terms of free and slave. So this pattern is going to force them to double down on their defense of slavery, right? You end up with these loud and boisterous speeches like the ones I've already read to you from men like Hammond and Alexander Stephens, where they know that they're going to lose. They know that they're going to lose, but they can't let it go. And so you're going to see that the disparity is not simply in terms of, obviously by 1861, the North has the votes to do whatever they want to do, and the South just has to lump it, which is one of the reasons why they decide to get out, right? In 1861, they decided to get out of the Union. But we need to talk about the status of their economy and manufacturing during this time. Now, according to a report from the United States Census Bureau entitled Manufacturers of the United States in 1860, the improvement of raw cotton into finished products occurred mostly in New England and in the Middle States. In the South, 159 cotton factories produced about $9.5 million worth of product. Contrast this with merely 6 New England states, which had 570 establishments. So the South had 159, New England has 570. The South produced about $9.5 million. These 6 states produced almost $80 million in finished products. And even the middle states, the Midwestern states, they had like more than 200 additional factories than what you found in the South, and they produced $26.5 million worth of produce compared to the South's $9.5 million. So the North and the South, in terms of what they produce, is not even close. The North produces carpet and hose and shirts and collars. They manufacture all kinds of things. There are none of these manufacturers in the South. In terms of clothing produced in 1860, the United States had a total of 3,793 establishments. The Southern states possessed only 352 of these. So let me repeat those numbers, because numbers can kind of float away in your brain when you're listening. It's almost 3,800, right? 3,800. Out of that, about 350 in the South. And most of these were in Louisiana, about 213. With coal and iron mining, the South also suffered a dramatic disadvantage. Nearly 90% of all mining, iron, and steel works produced by the United States occurred in the northern states. A mere 583 manufacturing facilities dealing with metallurgy existed in the South in 1860. Clearly, the South's lack of economic diversity meant that vital manufactured goods had to be imported. Economically, the South operated similarly to the English colonies back in the 1600s. Under mercantilism in the 17th and 18th centuries, the colonies produced the raw materials necessary for the British economy to thrive. Southern plantations produced enough cotton for world consumption, but depended upon the world for finished goods. This dependence also included reliance upon northern bankers for credit, and the antagonism of Jacksonian Democrats to the National Bank reflects this uneasiness with their dependence. Southerners believed it was their agricultural products that made northern manufacturing possible. Therefore, in their minds, the South was more important. These Southerners resented their lower status nationally. Their image as poor and backward led many to resent the mistreatment, what they thought was mistreatment by the federal government, due to loose monetary policies and tariffs. So just to continue on this same vein, I want to make sure we kind of look at some of these charts. You can see in this slide the degree of dependence by which the southern states were in. Okay, so this has to do with cloth production in 1860, and you can see the different things. You have carpet, carding, hosiery, woolen goods, cotton goods, different types of manufacturing here. And you can see that the South is, other than the Pacific states, which in 1860 was California, it's incredibly low. All of these southern states are very low compared to the rest of the United States. So if you were to pick a fight between New England, the middle states, and the western states all together, and then the southern states, you can see who's going to win that fight based just on manufacturing goods, right? So that's cloth. Let's look at some other goods here. Let's look at men's and women's clothing. This goes into more detail about the number of hats and linen and silk products that are produced. And you can see that, the South produces very little, or at least the least amount. Going into mining and metallurgy, The South produces about the same as New England in terms of its metallurgy and casting, but look at the middle states and the western states. They're just over and above any of the rest of the United States. So these northern states are going to have all of the industrial capacity to produce weapons, to produce clothing, to produce boots, to produce everything that you need to fight a war. The South is just not going to be able to compete. Here we see machinery. You can see even in machinery, the middle states and the New England states are far above. Now, Southerners didn't need machinery. The only machine that they relied on was the cotton gin. And the South had 52 different cotton gin manufacturers opposed to 5 in the rest of the country. So that was the only machine they thought they needed in the South. So, you know, the reapers and the more advanced farming implements, you're not going to see those things developed in the South because they're not diversifying their economy, and it's going to cost them a war here. I mean, the South is going to pick a fight with the rest of the country, and it's not even fair. I mean, the South is poor. The South is backward. And that's going to prove to be a problem. Now, there was one man who tried to change that, and his name is William Gregg. Let's talk a little bit about him. So the father of the Southern textile industry, William Gregg, is going to be someone who's going to attempt to inject some industry into the South. So he's considered, you know, he's going to try this, but it's not going to work because the diversification isn't there. William Gregg was born in 1800 to a Virginian war veteran and a Quaker mother. Historians note him for his advocacy for Southern industrialization, and he was seeing the unequal relationship between the North and the South. I mean, he goes to the North and you can see how wealthy they are compared to the South. Gregg believed that the best way for the South to compete was to diversify its economy, which of course is obvious. In 1844, he traveled through the northern United States to study the different textile mills of New England. Upon his return to South Carolina, he wrote a series of articles for the Charleston Courier. And in these articles, Gregg lamented the current relationship between the North and the South. The South sends raw materials to the North, and the Southerners purchase these same materials at inflated prices in the form of manufactured goods. Gregg's efforts led to the creation of the largest textile mill in the South, the Graniteville Manufacturing Company in South Carolina. Of course, the efforts of men like Gregg would not catch on fast enough to enable the South to truly reach parity with Northern manufacturing. In fact, even to this day, we're just now seeing the South begin to catch up in manufacturing within this last 50 or 60 years with the automobile industry moving into the South and more industrial jobs. So let's take a look at the character of the Old South. You know, what are these people like? What are they interested in? So let's take a look at the social hierarchy. Let me get out of the way here. All right. So the social structure of the antebellum South organized various people of the South into a hierarchy. Okay. The planters, or the large plantation owners, made up about 5% of the population. The average Southerner, about 70 to 80% of the population, managed to make a living through agriculture on a much smaller scale, and many of these small operators could not afford slaves. However, those who did usually had a closer relationship with their slaves. In other words, the common Southern whites would have shared their home, their food, and a lot more time with their slaves than these traditional, massive plantation owners would. Now, that is not to suggest that these slaves were equal to their white owners. Obviously, that's not true. It merely suggests that they lived together in a much closer relationship. So below the common white Southerner, you have the poor white Southerner. And these people did not have the money to own slaves, and in many cases suffered privations very similar to slaves. They had very little food, they had few comforts. Regardless, these poor whites supported the institution of slavery because it granted them an unearned sense of superiority over another class of people. One of the best examples of this that I've ran across comes from Mark Twain, and it's a description of Pap Finn, which is Huckleberry Finn's father, describing a free black man who came down to Missouri, and how he is, incensed that this black man, this free black man from the North, who speaks 4 or 5 languages and is a professor at a college, can't be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Right? It's just sort of this ignorance that, well, I'm poor and I'm miserable, but I'm better than you simply because of my identity. So this sort of identity politics is rather nasty. I left the full quote from the book that you could go in and you can read it if you haven't read Huckleberry Finn. Due to the negligence of our education system, please do so. Huckleberry Finn is the greatest American novel, arguably. Now, the irony of this whole thing is that here's this horrible person who beats his child, right? He beats Huckleberry Finn. He's a drunk. He can't keep a job. He's a miserable, horrible ruffian, and yet he sees himself superior by default simply because he's white. This helps to explain why a lot of white people would go along with slavery even though they're not benefiting from it, right? I mean, a lot of these white people, they don't own slaves. They're fighting in this war, the Civil War that's coming, but they're not fighting for slavery per se. They're fighting for their status as, at least I'm better than you, almost. I mean, I know it's hard to make these broad generalizations, but that's one potential explanation for this. But regardless, the number of Southerners who owned slaves was very small. So if I bring you back to this chart, which shows you the number of slave owners by state, and you can see that there's the total number of slaves in red, and then the average number of people in the state who hold slaves. Okay, so if you take a look at this chart, you'll see, for example, we'll look at Texas. Texas at 182,566 slaves and 21,878 slave owners. So those 180,000 people were split up between 21,000 people. And most of these people don't own very many slaves at all. Furthermore, according to the 1860 census, more than 20% of slave owners only owned a single slave. And most, 54.8 or 55% of slave owners owned 5 or fewer. Social mobility for ambitious men propelled some into higher classes. An easy path to success for many people was just to take advantage of the cheap land that you could buy out west, and then buy more land than you could ever farm yourself, and then purchase slave labor to do the work for you, and you could sit back and enjoy the labor of other people, right? An example of this comes from Ireland. A man named John Burnside of Ireland. He moved to the United States and he built a massive plantation in Louisiana known as the Huma. Huma? I should know how to pronounce this, being in Southeast Texas, but apparently it's escaping me. But this was a plantation purchased by Burnside in 1857, and he expanded this 10,000-acre estate by more than 2,000 acres. So this is a 12,000-acre estate, and he owned more than 700 slaves. He was able to become a serious millionaire as a result to exploiting the labor of these unfortunate slaves in Louisiana. But this was unusual, right? This was not common for someone to have this much money or to own this many slaves. Most people didn't own any, and more than half of people, as I've already mentioned, what the numbers are here. So another example of someone earning a little bit of money in the South would be Thomas House. Thomas W. House, he did not own slaves, as far as I know. He was born in England in 1814. He moved to New York in 1835, and here he learned his trade as a baker. In 1836, he moved to New Orleans and then was inspired to help Texas in its fight against Mexico, right? Its fight for independence. And so he moved to Texas and fought in the war for independence. Afterward, he opened up a bakery and confectionery in Houston, Texas, where he was the first man to sell ice cream in the city of Houston. And to improve commerce and investment, House would encourage road construction and steamboat operations. In 1862, the people elected him to be the mayor of Houston. And even after the war, he continued to help encourage investment, and created the first utility company in Houston, Texas, which was a gas company there. So it was possible for you to gain wealth without slavery. It's a lot easier. It was an easier path to take, to just buy a bunch of land and then purchase a bunch of slaves and then just sit back and let them do the work. As inefficient as it was, really, slavery was an incredibly inefficient way to make money, for reasons that we can go into if you want to, but I don't think you'll want to, and I don't have the time to do it right now. So you can come by and visit with me, and we can talk about it if you like. So the last thing we're going to touch on here is this sort of persecution complex that many Southerners had. Most Southerners lived in rural isolation. In fact, for much of the 19th century, no significant artistic or cultural achievements came from the South. As the growing disapproval of slavery and its continuation spread through the states, many Southerners became overly defensive, believing that their way of life was under attack. These people developed the persecution complex, or the idea that other people possessed hostility toward them. Southerners lived in an honor society. Honor was quite important to a Southern gentleman, and dueling was common. Although they generally saw themselves as law-abiding people, lynchings, duels, fighting, and gunplay were very common. If you've ever looked up the history of Jim Bowie, for example, you'll know what I'm talking about. So you've got these they're rough and tumble people, very much built on honor, an honor-based system, and so they will fight to preserve their honor, and that's what we're going to see happening with the Civil War. These men and this civilization is going to have one last gasp before it is crushed by industrialization, or by the North and industrialization. So hopefully this conversation about the Antebellum South, about slavery, the defenses of slavery, the rising movement of abolition, and the disparities between the North and the South will help you not only understand the coming conversation when we talk about this political crisis that we're going to face in 1850, but also the coming Civil War and why it is inevitable. At least, well, nothing's inevitable, but why it, when you're looking back on it, it seems inevitable that the South would end up losing this conflict. So when we get back in our next lecture, we're going to be talking about this crisis. We've got all this land from the Mexican War. We've got Texas that wants to join as a slave state. What are we going to do? How are we going to solve this? Let's see if Henry Clay has one more compromise up his sleeve to save the country from an impasse, a political impasse that looks like it might lead to war. So we'll talk about that when we get back. All right.